The EA-18G Growler has a maximum speed of 1,960 kilometers an hour.
The EA-18G Growler can blind an entire air defense network without destroying a single radar. It does this by filling every operator's screen with aircraft that don't exist. The radar is working. The operators are following procedure. The picture they're acting on is fiction. The EA-18G Growler carries no bombs on a strike mission. Its jamming pods don't transmit noise. They transmit signals more convincing than the returns from real aircraft. The radar network it attacks will be functioning perfectly throughout the engagement. It will simply be seeing a world the Growler built. Before the Growler transmits a single watt, it has already been working for several minutes. Its first weapon is silence. The ALQ-218 tactical jamming receiver sits in the aircraft's wingtip pods, passive, generating no emissions, and monitoring every frequency across a bandwidth wider than most people know radar occupies. A modern integrated air defense system doesn't run one radar. It runs a layered network: long-range early warning radars, medium-range acquisition radars, fire control radars linked to surface-to-air missile batteries, and short-range terminal defense systems filling the gaps between them. Each one transmits on different frequencies, different pulse patterns, different scan rates. The ALQ-218 receives all of it simultaneously, dozens of separate emitters across a frequency range comparable to monitoring every FM radio station on the dial, and several hundred more beyond the audible spectrum simultaneously, while moving at 400 knots toward the center of the coverage. Each radar emission is a fingerprint. The pulse repetition interval, for the time between successive radar pulses, is as unique to a radar model as an engine note is to a specific aircraft type. The pulse width, the scan rate, the frequency agility pattern, the power level at detection range, all of these parameters combine into an emission signature the ALQ-218 compares against a classified threat library containing the documented characteristics of every known radar system. A Soviet-era SA-6 fire control radar and a more modern SA-17 may operate in overlapping frequency ranges, but their pulse patterns are distinguishable within the first few seconds of detection. The EW officer watching the threat display sees not just a contact, but an identification, a specific radar type with documented vulnerabilities, and a documented response in the jamming system's technique library. The threat library entry for each radar doesn't just identify it, it prescribes how to attack it. Different radars are vulnerable to different electronic attack techniques, and the wrong technique applied to the wrong radar produces an outcome the Growler does not want. A noise jammer transmitted on a fixed frequency against a frequency-agile radar, one that hops its operating frequency faster than the jammer can follow, fails to suppress the radar and simultaneously gives the radar operator a precise bearing line to the jamming aircraft. The radar can no longer see through the noise on the frequencies the jammer is covering, but it can resolve the bearing of the jamming source with precision sufficient to cue a surface-to-air missile battery to engage the Growler directly. The jammer has done the targeting work for the system it was trying to suppress. This is why the Growler's first phase is silence. Begin jamming too early, and the radar network detects the jamming bearing before the strike package has reached its ingress corridor, cueing early engagement of both the escort and the aircraft it is protecting. Wait too long, and the strike aircraft enter radar coverage before the electronic attack is established, and suppression that arrives after detection provides no tactical benefit. The timing of the first transmission is a decision the EW officer makes based on the strike package's position, the radar network's coverage geometry, and the threat library's recommended stand-in range for each technique being employed. The EW officer's display updates continuously. Emitter symbols populate across the threat picture one by one, each one appearing as the ALQ-218's classification algorithm resolves enough pulse data to confirm the identification. An SA-6 acquisition radar appears at the 11 o'clock position, 65 miles out, tagged with its threat priority and recommended technique. A long-range early warning radar registers at 12 o'clock, 110 miles, lower priority, already at the edge of effective jamming range. A fire control radar associated with a more capable SAM system registers at 1 o'clock, 48 miles, highest priority, the one that kills the strike aircraft if it achieves a tracking solution. The Growler holds course, no transmissions. The pilot watches his fuel and the waypoint timer. The EW officer watches the threat picture fill in around them, building a map of a radar network that has no idea it is being read. The ALQ-99 pod doesn't have one jamming technique. It has several, and applying the wrong one to the wrong radar makes the operator's job easier, not harder. The ALQ-99 jamming pod is a turbine-powered transmitter that generates its own electrical power from the airstream moving across its generator turbine. The aircraft's own generators cannot supply enough electrical power for high-energy jamming while simultaneously running flight systems, sensors, and communications. The pod's turbine solves this by converting airspeed into electrical output, a solution that introduces a constraint the EW officer accounts for in every engagement. Below a minimum airspeed, the turbine cannot maintain the generator RPM required for full power jamming output. The Growler's electronic attack capability has an airspeed floor, and tactics that require low-speed loiter over the target area trade jamming power for flight profile flexibility. An escort Growler flying with a strike package has less tactical flexibility than a Growler orbiting at standoff. Both have different effects on the radar network. The mission plan assigns each role based on which effect the threat environment requires. The radar operators on the other end of the ALQ-99's transmission have trained against noise jamming. Their systems have electronic countermeasures designed specifically to burn through it. The noise is not the main event. The ALQ-99 transmits in two primary modes depending on the threat being addressed. Spot jamming concentrates the pod's entire available power output onto a single frequency, the specific operating frequency of the target radar. The radar receiver at that frequency is overwhelmed by a jamming signal orders of magnitude stronger than any aircraft skin return it was designed to process. The operator's display goes blank at that bearing. The radar cannot distinguish signal from noise and reports nothing in the jammed sector. Against a single frequency radar with no frequency agility, spot jamming is decisive. All power, one target, one result. Barrage jamming distributes that same power across a wide frequency band, enough bandwidth to cover the full frequency range a frequency-agile radar might use during its hop sequence. No single frequency within the barrage receives the full power density spot jamming delivers, so no single radar is suppressed as completely. But every radar operating within the barrage band experiences degradation, and a frequency-agile radar that hops away from a spot jammer finds the barrage waiting at the new frequency. The trade-off is absolute: maximum power against one threat, or reduced power against several simultaneously. The EW officer makes this allocation decision for every threat in the picture, continuously as the situation evolves. Concentrate everything on the fire control radar tracking the strike package, and the acquisition radar behind it continues building a picture unimpeded. Spread power across both, and neither is suppressed below the threshold that matters. That threshold is the burn-through range. Every jamming engagement has a crossover distance at which the target radar's own transmitted power and reflected from a real aircraft produces a return strong enough to overcome the jamming signal at the radar receiver. Jamming effectiveness falls as the inverse square of the distance between the jammer and the radar. Double the standoff range and the jamming power density at the radar drops to 1/4. The radar's own return from an aircraft falls as the inverse fourth power of the distance between the radar and the aircraft. At long range, the jammer wins. At short range, the radar wins. The crossover point is the burn-through range, and it defines the inner boundary of the corridor the Growler must keep the strike package outside while maintaining effective suppression. The next generation jammer pod changes this calculation by changing the architecture, where the ALQ-99 uses a traveling wave tube to generate its jamming signal through a single aperture, comparable to a single powerful flashlight that can only point one direction at a time. The NGJ uses an active electronically scanned array, hundreds of individual transmit-receive modules arranged across the pod face, each independently steerable in phase and frequency. The NGJ generates multiple simultaneous jamming beams, each aimed at a different threat radar, each running a different technique, each operating at a different frequency, without dividing the power budget the way a single aperture system must. A single ALQ-99 pod cannot spot jam two radars simultaneously. A single NGJ pod can address several threats at near full effectiveness against each. He's steering its beams in microseconds between assignments as the threat picture updates. DRFM doesn't attack the radar, it attacks the operator's ability to trust what the radar is telling him. Those are different problems with different solutions, and only one of them has a defense. Digital radio frequency memory captures an incoming radar pulse with complete fidelity, sampling the waveform at nanosecond intervals, each interval shorter than the duration of a camera flash, divided by 1,000,000, storing it digitally and retransmitting a modified version before the echo from a real aircraft at the same range would arrive. The retransmitted pulse is received by the radar as a skin return. The radar receiver cannot distinguish between a real reflection and a DRFM-generated injection because the injected signal is a perfect copy of the radar's own pulse, modified only in the parameters the Growler chooses to alter. The radar built its pulse waveform. The DRFM system used that waveform against it. The EW officer's allocation display updates as a new fire control radar transitions from acquisition mode to tracking mode. Its pulse pattern changing in a way that ALQ-218 classifies in under 2 seconds. The NGJ beam assigned to that emitter shifts technique automatically, the new assignment computed and executed before the officer has finished reading the alert. The pod face is steering multiple beams simultaneously, each one invisible, each one carrying a different instruction to a different radar receiver. The officer adjusts the power allocation manually for the highest priority threat, dragging its budget upward. 3 other emitters' allocations compress proportionally. The display reflects the new state in the same second. Outside, the strike package is 40 miles from the target and has not yet been tracked by any fire control radar. The aircraft the Growler is protecting never appear on the radar screen, not because they're invisible, because the operator has 50 contacts demanding his attention and no way to know which are real. Range gate pull-off uses time delay injection to migrate a track the radar has already established on a real aircraft. The Growler begins retransmitting the radar's tracking pulse with a delay matching the real aircraft's range, generating a return that appears at the same position as the genuine contact. With the radar's tracking gate, the processing window that follows a contact through successive position updates locks onto the stronger return, which is the injected signal. The Growler then gradually increases the time delay, microseconds per pulse, walking the tracking gate away from the real aircraft's position at a rate slow enough that the radar's algorithm accepts each successive range update as a plausible position change. After several seconds, the tracking gate has migrated miles from the real aircraft. The fire control solution built from that track is unusable. A missile launched against it misses by the same margin the track was displaced. Velocity gate pull-off applies the same technique to the radar's Doppler channel. The Growler injects a return with a frequency shift corresponding to the real aircraft's radial velocity, and then gradually alters the injected frequency to create a phantom that appears to be accelerating beyond any real aircraft's performance envelope. The radar's velocity tracking gate follows the injected signal. When the Doppler shift has been walked far enough from the real contact's velocity, the gate locks on whichever return is stronger, typically the injected signal, and loses the real aircraft. Too fast and the ECCM algorithm flags the acceleration as physically implausible and rejects the track. Too gradual and the gate doesn't separate from the real aircraft before the engagement window closes. The injection rate is calibrated against the specific radar model's tracking filter characteristics, information that came from the threat library before the first transmission was made. In fact, the radar operator who turns his system off to escape the jamming has solved one problem and created a worse one. The Growler was waiting for exactly that decision. False target saturation operates at a different scale than individual track manipulation. The DRFM system generates simultaneous phantom returns at dozens of different ranges, bearings, and velocities, each one constructed to pass the radar's plausibility filters for a real aircraft contact. A radar screen that displayed 5 contacts now shows 60. Each new contact has a waveform consistent with a real return. Each one requires the operator to evaluate, attempt to correlate with adjacent radar data, and either initiate a track or dismiss. The correlation step is the attack's actual mechanism. A single radar generating 60 contacts floods the network data fusion node, connecting it to adjacent radars. The fusion algorithm attempts to correlate each contact against track files from neighboring sensors. If those neighboring sensors were also being jammed, the correlation attempts fail and the algorithm generates network-level false tracks. Phantoms that now appear as confirmed contacts on every radar in the sector, propagating like a single wrong entry, corrupting a shared spreadsheet that every node is reading simultaneously. Operators at radars that never detected the false contact directly are tracking it as a confirmed network-level threat and queuing their own weapon systems accordingly. The radar operator's display fills faster than the annotation's software can label contacts. Track symbols stack in the sectors where false target density is highest, enough simultaneous returns to populate the screen with the equivalent of a full carrier air wing generated by a single aircraft orbiting outside the SAM engagement envelope. The operator calls contacts to the battle management cell. Contact bearing 045, range 60, track initiating. Another at bearing 038, range 55. Another, the cell cannot correlate any of them. The real strike package transits a corridor at bearing 025, range 40, in the gap between the false target clusters the Growler placed to bracket the ingress route. The operators are not ignoring the real aircraft. They cannot isolate it from the picture. An SA-6 operator who shuts his radar down preserves his equipment and surrenders his coverage. The strike corridor he was defending is unmonitored. Yet an operator who leaves the radar on accepts a different problem: the AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missile. The Growler also carries homes on radar emissions at ranges exceeding the radar's own detection range against the launch aircraft. A radar that activates to burn through jamming has announced its precise location to a weapon that may already be in the air. The Growler does not need to fire the harm to change the operator's behavior. The operator knows it is there. The choice between being jammed and being destroyed is not a choice between two acceptable options. It is a choice between two versions of mission failure, and the Growler forces it before the strike package enters the defended area. The electronic attack does not end when the jamming begins. The opposing EW operators are working throughout the strike, frequency hopping, switching to backup modes, attempting to use the jamming signal's bearing to cue short-range systems that don't depend on the suppressed radar for targeting. The Growler's EW officer is updating technique assignments, reallocating power, and managing the DRFM injection library in real time against an adversary doing the same. It is not a one-time suppression event. It is a sustained competition between two electronic warfare teams, one of whom built the picture the other is trying to restore. The air defense system the Growler attacked is still running. Every radar is operational. Every operator is following procedure. The picture they are acting on is not real, and they cannot confirm which parts of it are false without restoring exactly the picture the Growler is preventing them from having. And acting on an untrustworthy picture is more dangerous than not acting. A commander who fires missiles at unverified contacts exhausts his magazine against phantoms, while the real targets complete their run. Not acting surrenders the mission the air defense system exists to perform. That is the weapon, not the signal, the doubt.